The prayer hall was never silent. It could not be. Even in the hours between sanctioned labor and mandatory rest, the walls still vibrated with the hum of faith. Voxcasters embedded into the stone sang the Emperor's litany in endless loops, so that even the dust that hung in the air seemed to quiver to its rhythm. The floor trembled faintly beneath thousands of synchronized knees, flesh bowing upon steel grates polished thin by generations of devotion. The air smelled of incense, rust, and bodies pressed too close together, as though we were one mass of breathing clay waiting to be shaped into obedience. And I was one among them, kneeling, back bowed, mouth moving, like the rest, exactly like the rest. That is how it must be, for the Imperium does not forgive hesitation. It does not forgive silence. In the Empire of Man, silence is the seed of treachery. I remember the sound of the hymn, how it rose like a tide, an ocean of identical words surging against the edges of the hall. Each syllable was hammered flat by repetition until meaning itself drowned beneath sheer volume. There was no melody, no beauty, only rhythm, endless, blunt rhythm designed not to inspire but to obliterate thought. And for years it worked. The chant entered my lungs as naturally as breath. The syllables dripped from my tongue like water from a leaking pipe, mechanical, ceaseless. I did not think of their meaning. I did not question. To question was death. To falter was suspicion. I knew this, as every child born beneath the Emperor's gaze knows this. Yet on that day, amid the storm of voices, the thought came. It was nothing, a fragment, barely a breath in the furnace of devotion. But it lodged inside me, sharp as glass. What if the Emperor does not hear? The words did not belong to me, and yet they echoed within me. They did not shout. They did not demand. They whispered, soft as a moth brushing against a wall, and yet they broke the rhythm. For the first time in my life, I heard the hymn not as one, but as many. The man beside me wheezed between verses. A woman's tongue stumbled, her lips cracked with thirst. A child, too young to remember why he was there, mouthed words with eyes already vacant. Their voices, once indistinguishable, separated themselves in my ears, thin and trembling and human. And in that fragile fracture of sound, the whisper returned. What if he does not hear? I tried to smother it. I forced my lips to move faster, harder, as though speed could cleanse me. I struck my chest with my fist in rhythm to the prayer. I tasted iron as my teeth split my lip. Still the thought gnawed at me. If the Emperor does not hear, then what are these words for? If he does not hear, then why do we bleed them out day after day? The incense choked me. The smoke poured through the air like gauze, blurring faces, blending us into shadows. I tried to drown myself in it, but in smoke, silence spreads easily. My voice faltered, not for long, not even for the length of a full breath, but enough that I knew it was noticed. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in the air, a cold weight pressing on my back as though someone had leaned forward, focusing their gaze through the fog of devotion. My neck stiffened, my tongue stumbled again. I swallowed hard, forcing the prayer through gritted teeth, but the damage had already been done. The eyes were there. I could feel them sliding over me, precise, deliberate. Not the gaze of the Emperor, who is said to watch all things, but something closer, smaller, and far more dangerous. In the Imperium, the Emperor may judge your soul. But it is the eyes of the faithful beside you that decide how long you live. I dared not lift my head, dared not break rhythm again. I pressed my forehead to the cold grate and let my voice rasp louder, until my throat tore with the effort. I wanted whoever watched to hear my desperation, to hear how eager I was to erase my hesitation. But the knowledge of their gaze never left me. It followed me through the final verses. It pressed against my skin as we were dismissed, as the congregation shuffled out in silent rows. It stayed with me even as I stepped into the corridors of the Hab block, where dim lumen strips flickered against rusted pipes and the reek of oil clung to the stone. Even when I tried to convince myself it had been imagination, the sensation remained. The eyes were there. They had seen me falter, and in that moment I understood the cruelty of a whisper. It does not matter how small it is. In the Imperium, where faith is iron and unity is survival, even the faintest deviation is thunder. A whisper is not just a sound. It is a wound in the great flesh of obedience. And wounds, no matter how small, must be cut out. I remember gripping the edges of my work robe as I walked, nails digging into the fabric until my hands bled. I remember the pounding of my heart against my ribs as I repeated the prayer beneath my breath again and again, as if saying it in solitude could patch the fracture. But it was too late. I had already learned what silence sounded like. And someone else had learned it too. When I reached the steel door of my HAB unit, I stopped. My hand hovered over the access rune, but I did not press it. Instead, I turned. Slowly. The corridor behind me stretched long and empty, lumen globes buzzing faintly in the shadows. Pipes dripped in the distance. Nothing moved, and yet I knew with certainty as cold as a blade at the throat. There, at the far end of the corridor, half hidden in the haze, stood a figure, shrouded in robes, their face obscured by shadow, still, silent, watching. The hymn still rang in my ears, but now it was hollow. The voices of thousands had meant nothing. The incense, the rhythm, the ritual, nothing. All that remained was the silence between one breath and the next. And in that silence I understood. My whisper had already been heard. I had thought the whisper would fade. That, like smoke, it would disperse with time, thinned by the noise of labor, smothered by the weight of routine. But whispers, I would learn, do not vanish. They root. They burrow. They breed silence in the marrow. And worse than silence, they breed eyes. From the moment the thought entered me, what if he does not hear? The world changed. Or perhaps it was not the world that changed, but the way it looked back at me. Every corridor, every stairwell, every flickering lumen now held the potential for witness. Every face, no matter how weary or blank, became a mask that might be hiding suspicion, a mask that might at any moment unmask me. It began with glances, or what I thought were glances. A coworker pausing just a moment longer than usual before handing me the cog key. A HAB mate nodding without looking, as though their eyes were fixed elsewhere. A child staring as I passed, then looking quickly away. Perhaps they were nothing. Perhaps they were everything. You learn to read people in the Imperium not by their words, but by their restraint, by what they do not say. The measure of loyalty is not passion, but performance, a perfect echo of the creed, unbroken, unhesitating, unflinching. It is a theater without applause, only scrutiny. And once I had faltered, I was no longer part of that rhythm. I felt it, the dissonance between my breath and theirs, between my gestures and the others. Like a cog with a single chipped tooth, I no longer turned cleanly with the machine. The manufactorum was the worst. Inside, the air never moved. It pressed against the lungs like damp cloth. Steam hissed from ruptured valves. Servo arms groaned overhead, their shadows sliding like skeletal fingers across the steel floor. We worked in lines, faceless, hunched, repetitive. Each motion the same as the last, drilled into our muscles since youth. Each gesture a prayer, each rivet a hymn. And yet I could not escape the feeling that someone, perhaps everyone, was counting my movements. I imagined them measuring the exact angle of my bow, the rhythm of my breath, the speed of my hand across the panel. Was it too slow, too fast, too stiff, too hesitant? Did I flinch when the Emperor's name echoed from the Vox Gasters above? Did I blink too often when the Shrine Sergeant passed? My body became an enemy I could not trust. My own face traitorous. Too much expression was zealotry, too little was apathy. The perfect face was the one that never moved, yet always obeyed. A face I could no longer wear. So I copied others. I watched the man to my left, how he blinked once every 10 counts, how he bowed his head 3 degrees when the hymn reached its peak. I mirrored his stance. I mirrored the tilt of his shoulders, the subtle flex of his jaw. I became a mimic of a mimic, an echo of an echo, hoping that if I matched him precisely, I might disappear inside him. But the fear did not fade. It only deepened. Because in the Imperium, to pretend is itself a crime. To simulate faith is to admit you have lost it. And so every time I copied a gesture, I wondered, do they see that I am imitating? Do they know I am no longer real? I stopped speaking unless spoken to. My words became trimmed and mechanical. Yes, brother, as decreed, the Emperor protects, never more, never less. I feared even intonation, that a syllable too soft might sound doubtful, or a pause too long might seem reflective. Reflection is dangerous. In the hab corridors, I walked with eyes lowered. The walls there were narrow and slick with condensation. Pipes rattled in the ceilings like bones in a grave. Lumen globes flickered, each failure casting the hallway into a heartbeat of darkness. I hated that darkness not because it blinded, but because it freed the eyes around me. In the dark, I could not see who stared. But I could feel them. I could feel their presence behind me like heat on the spine. I imagined eyes glinting between doorways, watching from half-sealed vents, peering through inspection slits left ajar. The hab was a hive, and every cell had an opening. The gaze could come from anywhere, from anyone, even from those you shared bread with, even from those you once called kin. There was a woman in my corridor, Sister Marentia, who once shared ration tea with me after the night shift. She had a gentle face, soft around the eyes. One evening I caught her watching me as I bowed before the wall shrine. She smiled, but it was not warmth, it was measurement. I held the bow longer that night. My knees ached, my back screamed. But I did not rise until I heard her steps fade down the hall. Even sleep brought no refuge. I dreamed of corridors with no end, lined with statues of eyeless saints, all facing me. I dreamed of faces peeling open like scrolls, their insides inked with my own thoughts, written in a language I did not know I spoke. And always the same phrase came back to me. What if he does not hear? Not as blasphemy, but as question, as wound, because if he does not hear, then they must, and they do. The Emperor's gaze is eternal, they say. His light burns through shadow. His judgment pierces lies, but his light is distant, his judgment is slow. It is the eyes of neighbors that kill you first, the ones who nod at you in the lift, the ones who share the assembly bench, the ones who smile when the hymn ends, who bow when the shrine sergeant passes, the ones who file quiet reports sealed with wax, slid beneath cogitator doors in the middle of the third watch. They do not scream. They do not accuse, they simply watch, and that is enough, because in the Imperium the worst crime is not heresy. It is being suspected of heresy. One day I cannot recall which I walked the drill yard between shifts. The ground there was dry, cracked with frost despite the heat of the manufactorum. Statues of saints loomed overhead, cloaked in rust and shadow. Servo skulls floated in slow patrols, their optics clicking softly as they scanned the workers for signs of fatigue, deviation, or doubt. I walked carefully, measured steps, straight spine, hands visible. Still, I felt them. The eyes. Not just human this time, mechanical too. The red optics of cherub servitors, the cold lenses of autoquill drones. Even the statues seemed to turn their heads when I passed. I could no longer tell which eyes were real. And worse, I could no longer tell if mine were. I feared blinking. I feared looking too long at anything. My gaze skittered from point to point, never resting, never thinking, because thought had become a luxury, and in the Imperium, luxuries are suspect. The weight of eyes was no longer external, it was inside me. Every movement became surveillance, every breath an interrogation. I had become both prisoner and warden, suspect and informer, victim and accuser. I was no longer living. I was performing survival, and still the whisper remained. Not louder, just constant, like a splinter under the nail, like a grain of sand in the eye, invisible but unbearable. What if he does not hear? One evening, perhaps the 31st since that whisper, I returned from the yard to find a mark upon my hab door. A thin line, etched by stylus, unmistakable. It was not a warning, it was an instruction. Inside, the lumen was already lit. A parchment lay on the ration slab. The seal was wax. The sigil was unmistakable, the winged skull of the local shrine enclave. I opened it with trembling hands. The words were simple. You are summoned. Attend the inner sanctum at the 7th bell. Delay is dereliction. Silence is guilt. I read it twice, thrice. My throat closed. The eyes had seen enough. The whisper had found its echo, and now I was called. They came for me at the 7th bell, not loudly, not with force, but with a quiet certainty that made resistance unthinkable. Two figures in dark robes, their faces obscured by half-masks of brass. They carried no weapons that I could see, yet I knew at once that they needed none. Authority itself walked with them. I followed. My feet moved before I told them to. My breath rasped shallow in my chest. Around us, the corridor was hushed, as if the hab itself understood that this was not a procession to be watched. Doors remained closed. No heads leaned from thresholds. Silence was the truest witness. The shrine's stairwell spiraled downward. The air thickened, growing colder with each descent. Stone gave way to metal, and metal to something older, blackened with soot, scarred by centuries of hands that had touched it with reverence or fear. The lumen globes here glowed faint, as if reluctant to show the way. Finally, we reached a door. Iron, reinforced, without ornament save for a single sigil etched at eye level, the Aquila. Not radiant, not golden, but corroded, as though even here his gaze had dimmed. The taller figure pressed a seal against the lock. With a groan, the door opened inward, revealing a chamber cut from shadow. I stepped inside. The air was colder than I expected, damp with condensation that dripped from pipes overhead. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with shelves of parchment, data slates, and half-burned candles. The smell was a mix of wax, rust, and something acrid that clung to the back of the throat. At the center stood a chair. Not a throne, not a seat of comfort, but a frame of iron bolted to the floor, its surface scarred with scratches that spoke of restless hands before mine. They gestured. I sat. The iron was colder than stone. It seeped into my spine, my arms, my legs, until it felt as though I was no longer a man but a vessel left to rust. My wrists trembled against the chair's arms. No shackles were placed upon me. None were needed. Across from me, 3 figures took their places. Robes of gray, faces pale in the dim light. No insignia of rank, no weapons, no names. They might have been priests, scribes, judges, or nothing at all. When they spoke, their voices were soft. Why did you falter in the hymn? No accusation, no anger, just the question placed between us like a blade on a table. My lips parted, but no words came. My throat felt stuffed with ash. I tried to speak, to shape something that might pass for loyalty, for repentance. But the silence stretched. The second voice came, no harsher than the first. When the Vox carried the Emperor's name, why did your tongue not move with the rest? They leaned forward slightly, not to threaten but to listen. That was worse. Their patience was a weight more crushing than wrath. It gave me no place to hide. I whispered something, a fragment. I was tired. The words felt brittle, laughable. Even as I said them, I hated them. Tired, as though weariness could excuse absence in devotion, as though the Emperor himself did not suffer endlessly upon the golden throne for the life of all mankind. They did not laugh. They did not scorn. They only watched. The third spoke, voice smooth as oil on water. You thought a thought, what was it? And there it was. The room contracted around me. The shadows pressed closer. My breath echoed louder than their words, louder than the slow drip of condensation from the ceiling. I remembered the whisper, the grain of doubt, the thought I had buried beneath motions, hymns, and mimicry. What if he does not hear? I could not say it. To speak it would make it real. To make it real would be to surrender, but they waited. Patience is a blade that cuts without moving. Finally, my lips moved, barely. I wondered. Their eyes did not narrow. Their bodies did not shift. They only wrote. Quills scratching across parchment, the sound dry as bone against stone. One repeated my words, slow, deliberate. You wondered. The syllables echoed, stripped of context, reduced to evidence. I gripped the arms of the chair. My nails bit against iron. The first spoke again, gently. Doubt is not yet heresy. Doubt is the shadow cast by faith. But tell us, how deep does your wondering go? Does it end with you, or does it spread? Spread, the word hollowed me. They were not only measuring me, they were measuring the infection I might carry. Was I a fracture contained within myself, or a fault line that could split the stone of others? I felt smaller than ever, not a worker, not a servant, not even a man, a crack waiting to be mapped. Their silence pressed harder than their questions. Every pause was a mirror in which I saw myself stripped bare. My justifications wilted in my chest. My excuses dissolved before I could form them. I spoke fragments, that I was tired, that my mind drifted, that the hymn had caught on my tongue. Lies, all of them fragile as glass. And still they wrote, not with haste, not with judgment, with patience, with certainty. Each scratch of the quill was another line etched into the record of my soul. Then I heard it, a low hum, mechanical, steady, alive. I looked to the side. A Vox unit, black and squat, its surface marked with purity seals and the wax of endless recordings. Its optics glowed faint red, a single ember in the dark. It was awake. It was listening. And every word I spoke, every hesitation, every fracture of breath was being captured, preserved. Not for these three alone, but for others. For those above them or beyond them or nameless altogether. Proof. Proof that I had faltered. Proof that I had wondered. Proof that the whisper lived within me. My chest tightened. I wanted to cry out, to deny, to recant. But the hum silenced me. To speak now was to add more. To remain silent was to confirm. Either way, the Vox drank everything. The third figure leaned closer, their shadow falling across my knees. Their voice was as soft as before. Tell us again, slowly. The chamber grew smaller still, and I realized then it was not fire, nor bolt round, nor execution that would destroy me. It was this, the chamber of questions, the patience of eyes, the permanence of sound. My hesitation now eternal. The questions changed. At first they had been about me, my faltering voice, my wondering silence, the crack in my devotion. But as the hours stretched and the candles guttered lower, their attention shifted slowly, imperceptibly, like the turning of a great wheel I had not noticed until it crushed me beneath its weight. Who stands near you during the hymn? One asked, his tone as calm as before. The others leaned forward. The quills did not stop their scratching. I tried to answer plainly, without hesitation. Names came to my lips, comrades, workers in the hab line. Those who labored beside me, their sweat mixing with mine, their voices raised with mine in the daily chant. But as each name passed my tongue, I felt it unravel into accusation. Their syllables, harmless in my memory, became heavy in the chamber. The interrogator asked, "Did you notice them falter as you did?" I wanted to shake my head, to say no, to protect, but the silence that followed demanded an answer. It was not enough to deny. It was never enough. Perhaps, I whispered, perhaps their voices dimmed once. The quills drank it in. Another entry, another line that would not die. The chamber shifted around me. The iron chair groaned beneath my trembling weight. I heard echoes in my skull, echoes not born of memory but of something deeper, darker. As if the walls themselves repeated my words back to me in voices I did not recognize. Perhaps, their voices dimmed. I clenched my fists against the iron rests, but the echoes would not stop. Now they asked about my family. My blood chilled. "My brother," I said, the word slipping free before I could stop it. He sings poorly. Always has. His voice cracks, he is nervous." They leaned closer, quills scratching. A shiver ran through me. In my brother's crooked notes, they would not hear weakness of lungs, but weakness of faith. A man's nature twisted into heresy by my tongue. And it was true, wasn't it? His voice did falter. His eyes did wander. His hands sometimes trembled when the litanies ran long. The thoughts sprouted roots in my chest. Did I bring them here with me? Were my doubts ever mine alone, or had I always carried them like a contagion? Had my hesitation in the hymn infected those closest to me? The interrogators asked, "Do you believe they wonder as you do?" The chamber tilted. My heart pounded. Sweat stung my eyes. I do not know," I stammered, but the doubt was already alive in me. And if it was alive in me, how could it not have bled into them? I remembered my comrades' glances, the way their eyes flickered when the hymns dragged on. I remembered my mother's silence, the way she mouthed the words without sound. I remembered the priest's tired smile, too thin, too human. The chamber swallowed me whole. Every face I had known rose before me, and behind each one a whisper. "They wonder as you do. They falter as you did. They are yours, and so they are guilty." I pressed my eyes shut. The shadows within were worse, for now I heard something else. Laughter. Not mortal laughter. Not kind, not human. A laughter that echoed from nowhere and everywhere, carried on a wind I could not feel but which coiled through the marrow of my bones. I knew it. Though I had never heard it before, I knew it. The archenemy, the eternal mockery, the opposite of all faith. The sound of a thousand throats whispering the same blasphemy in unison. The interrogators did not react. Their quills continued. Their eyes remained steady. Did they not hear it? Was it only in me? If it was only in me, then I was already lost. I whispered, desperate, "It is not mine, the thought is not mine." No response, only the scratching. The laughter grew louder. The Vox unit hummed, its red eye watching, recording, sealing each word. My own voice sounded distant, unrecognizable. My own heartbeat pounded against me like fists on iron. The questions came faster now. Who else do you suspect? Who else's voice falters? Whose eyes stray? What? Every name I gave was another wound carved into flesh not present to bleed. My tongue was the blade, and the blade did not stop. Each name carried weight, heavier than stone. Each syllable condemned more than one soul. It condemned their kin, their neighbors, their children. The contagion would spread outward, mapped by the careful hands of these gray-cloaked figures until an entire web of suspicion strangled the habline. And all of it began with me. My doubt was the seed. My words were the water. Their quills were the soil. And from that soil, a tree of heresy grew, its branches already stretching beyond me, beyond this chamber, into every life I had ever touched. I shook. My teeth rattled. I wanted to stop speaking, to seal my mouth, to bite down on my tongue until silence reigned. But the silence was worse. The silence was filled with echoes. The silence was filled with whispers. I could not tell where their questions ended and my own thoughts began. Were they asking me, or was I asking myself? I saw my brother's face, my mother's eyes, my comrades' hands. I saw them taken, questioned, broken beneath the same cold patience that stripped me now. And I knew it was my fault. Not tomorrow, not in some future judgment. Now, already. I had condemned them the moment I hesitated. I was not one man doubting. I was a fissure through which the archenemy poured. The laughter swelled, joined by whispers faint, like the scratching of nails on the other side of a wall. Words I could not grasp, but which carried the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I feared then that my mind was no longer mine, that the warp itself had taken root where the Emperor's light faltered. One of the figures finally ceased his writing. He looked up. His eyes caught mine. Then slowly he reached across the table. The quill in his hand gleamed faintly in the candlelight. Its nib was black with ink, its shaft bound in a strip of parchment inscribed with a prayer I could not read through my blurred vision. He placed it before me. "Write," he said. My hand trembled. "Write," he repeated, his voice as soft and patient as all the questions that had come before. "Write the first name that comes to mind." The chamber was utterly silent. Even the laughter seemed to wait, breathless, for my answer. They returned me not with fanfare, but with a ledger entry and the hollow clack of a latch. A clerk signed my name into a book whose pages smelled of dust and wax. A man with eyes like dead coin folded the slate over, pressed a stamp into the lead, and then sent me back into the daily apparatus as if nothing had been altered. But something had been. I had been rearranged. I thought at first that the change would be private, the tight knot in my stomach, the new timbre to my prayers, the small habit of checking the corners of every room before I slept. I was wrong. The shift was social. It moved through the block like a low, insidious current. Those dozen acquaintances with whom I had shared bread and a half of ration tea became a ring of statues. They continued to perform the motions of comradeship, an exchanged nod by the mess, a brief clack of boots across the yard. But their faces were shutters, shut and resolute. They spoke the formulas expected of them, but their words were thin as paper. Silence itself had found a weapon's edge. Where once the hymn had been a wall we built together, now it was a test to be administered. The Vox chant looped through the hab like a clockwork metronome, but the spaces between its measures had meaning. Those gaps, a breath taken too long, a hesitation on the final syllable, were not accidents. They were marks to be read by the diligent. The Emperor's name was no longer a comfort pronounced. It was an instrument struck to see if the metal rang true. I learned to measure my breaths the way an engineer measures torque, to calculate the precise angle of my nod, the permitted length of a pause. My mouth shaped the litanies on cue. I bowed my head at the exact tempo. I recited from the margin of my mind, counting syllables until prayer became arithmetic and arithmetic became survival. There is a numbing safety in repetition, a way to hide inside the familiar. But even repetition can be inspected. At parade, the sergeant moved past me with the soft scuff of souls that know shame. He did not stop, he only looked. The look was a device, precise and clinical. It swept across rows and caught the anomalies. Not the brutal gait of old punishment, not yet. A numeration, a taking of measure. His notebook would whisper our names into an archive I could not read. The commissar's voice, when he spoke, had nothing to do with faith. It was pedagogy, a lesson intended for the malleable. Remember your place. The creed is not a suggestion. We answered in tuned unison, but their answers no longer bounced back to me as solace. They landed like gavel strikes. At the shrine, the priests performed rituals with hands that had learned not to tremble. Their lips moved in a choreography that required no contemplation. I watched them from the back and tasted the liturgy as if it were ash on my tongue. Sometimes a choir boy would look my way as he passed, and I would see the exact second his expression divided, from institutional piety to calculative caution. Even the children were taught to surveil. The future has more eyes than the present. I became practiced at being seen without being read. I learned to carry a stillness that looked like obedience. When a work line malfunctioned and sparks flung like angry stars, I lifted a wrench and did the work with the neat, mechanical motions of someone who had never doubted their purpose. My hands knew the gestures. My mind rehearsed the cadence of contrition. A man beside me clapped my shoulder and murmured, "Good to have you back." I felt his palm as if it were a stamp pressing a brand I could not erase. But the silence is not merely absence of sound. It is an architecture. It shapes a room. It rearranges a body. My world shrank to the margins between prayers. There was a new literacy here. One read not with ears, but with the small peripheral muscles that twitch when suspicion passes by. You learn to look away before your gaze can betray you. You learn to keep your hands open in plain sight because closed hands invite questions. You learn that even laughter, if it comes at the wrong beat, can be an indictment. Sleep offered only thin refuge. I lay in my bunk under a canopy of rust-streaked plating, the condensers groaning like distant wails. Dreams were no longer escape. They were rehearsals of what might be asked of me. I dreamed of lists, names I had once recited as comrades, now boiled down to tokens of possible treachery. I woke with my mouth full of ash and the memory of a quill scratching across the skin of the world. The old alliances frayed. Where once we traded favors, a ration sleeve cut into two, a favor run for a sister who needed a med pack, now we exchanged nothing. Gifts became liabilities. A man brought me a scrap of cloth he found near the manufactorum. I shook my head and took it with fingers that would not relinquish warmth. To accept is to create a debt, and debts can be audited. I learned to refuse aid with a calm precision that masked terror. The more I mimicked the machine, the less I felt I resembled a man. My voice took on the flat cadence of the comformers. My laughter, when it came, sounded rehearsed. The corpus of the Hab watched me adapt. They saw me reassemble into a model citizen and yet remain distant. Perhaps they waited for the next false note. Perhaps they were waiting to measure the moment my performance cracked. There were the small cruelties, bureaucratic and intimate. Orders rerouted me. My watch was changed to the coldest shift. My mess tokens were occasionally shorted. The quartermaster's ledger showed a subtraction with no explanation. These could have been clerical errors. They could have been much else. The point is not the action, but the psychology behind it. An organism training its cells to spit out whatever is unhealthy. I learned the language of margins. Instruction notices hung on the labor halls, the emperor sees, the vigil watches, report anomalies. Such phrases are not guidance. They are instruments of fear, carved in formal script and bolted to the wall. When a notice mentioned procedural review, I knew what it meant. Ears and then questions. The words were bureaucratic flint. A single phrase struck them into fire. Sometimes, when anger rose like bile, I would stand at the narrow window of the laundry bay and watch ash drift over the manufactorum skyline. The manufactory chimneys belched a stage-black cloud that cut the light into a pail that had no warmth. I would press my forehead to the cold glass and try to imagine a world where thoughts were tolerated, where a question could be asked without being rendered evidence. The image would not hold. The glass was always colder than the idea, and still I spoke the prayers. I learned to make the syllables a prosthetic, a sound piece that replaced thought. I could recite litany after litany until my throat bled, and yet my internals refused solace. The Emperor's light, which had once felt like shelter, became a searchlight. It did not warm, it examined. It picked out every splinter and judged it too long. There were nights when I almost convinced myself it was all a theater, that if I performed sufficiently, the audience would smile and the scare would be forgotten. Then the smallest thing would betray me. A hesitation over a ration slip, a pause in salute, a blink that took an extra millisecond. That fraction of time stretched into a continent where accusations roamed. I began to measure time not by clocks but by watches. The 7th bell, the 3rd watch, the quarter after the chapel recitation. Each rung was a potential summons. Each pause a possible trap. The cumulative burden of that counting sank my shoulders gradually, quietly. It is a slow execution, suspicion, a hydra whose heads are taxes, remarks, ledger entries, a doorway left ajar. And then one morning I woke to a changed world. I rose at the edge of dawn as usual, the thin light seeping through the plating like cold blood. I dressed with mechanical care, smoothing the folds of my robe, checking the knot of my neckband twice. Habit had become armor. Habit had become weapon. I stepped toward my hab door and found it still. Not locked in the usual way, not barred by my latch. The ceiling plate lay flush against the rim, soldered from the outside. A neat band of sealing wax dripped like a tiny, bright wound. The wax bore the imprint I had learned to dread, an emblem of the Shrine Enclave, its wings pinching a skull. I ran my hand along the seam. It was warm, as if the seal had been placed only moments before. There was no handle on my side. No voice called me from the corridor. No footfalls, only the hum of the block and the far-off clang of factory bellows. The ceiling is not the threat you imagine. It is a constraint. It is a message in copper and wax. You are contained. You are observed. You will not leave until we have decided what to do with you. I pressed my ear to the door. From the outside, life continued. Boots, laughter that now sounded forced, the clatter of trays. The world made its small noises, wholly ignorant of the fact that I had been fenced off within inches of that life. I sat back on my cot, the seal's impression burned into my palm through the thin metal of the plate. The hab was suddenly a cage whose walls were social, made of glances, of ledger scratches, of sentences left unspoken. I understood then that the silence had become architecture, and architecture, when closed, becomes a prison. I waited for a summons. I waited for the soft tread of sandal soles that once brought tea and gossip. I waited for a knock that might be mercy or accusation. The hours lengthened into a single, taut filament of thought. Outside, the world kept praying. Inside, the air grew smaller and the silence deeper. They carried me out into the light as if it were a mercy. The square was larger than I remembered, an arena carved into the lower spires where sun rarely reached, a place of pale stone and high walls scored with old emblems. It smelled of hot metal and old oil, and the faint sweetness of perfumed incense burned to disguise other things. Platforms rose like ribs from the floor, and upon them stood the pillars of the enclave. Officers, priests, a row of men in plain gray who wore no insignia but whose faces were unreadable as a tomb. Between their ranks the crowd swelled, a tide of patched robes and work vests, of faces lit by the sputtering light of hanging braziers. They had arranged it like a sacred play. Curtains of black flanked the judge's dais. Banners proclaimed slogans in careful, angular type. Unity is strength, silence is sanction. The vox masts hung low, coils of wire dangling like lifelines, and the speakers fed the square with the measured tenor of the Ecclesiarchy. Narration, explanation, a voice that softened the angle of accusation into a lesson. I remember thinking, absurdly, that my life had been reduced to a set of cues, Walk here, kneel there, look up when the chorus says so. The guards guided me between lit braziers. Their hands were firm but not cruel. There was choreography to it all, ritualized cruelty. They led me like a contestant in some cruel liturgical farce where the hazard was not performance but survival. When they made me stand on the plinth, I felt naked in a new way. Not because my clothes were threadbare, they were, but because every motion was exposed to an apparatus of eyes. The crowd did not shout at first. They murmured a low animal sound. Their faces were masks of expectancy. Children were brought forward on the shoulders of mothers, small mouths already shaped into the syllables they had been taught to chant. The vox broadcast my name in a slow, deliberate register, the syllables official and flat like entries on a ledger. Somewhere a bell tolled, and it sounded like the heartbeat of the city. A preacher took the dais and declaimed. His voice rose and fell in the practiced cadence of sermon and litany, and he spoke of impurity not as sin but as rust, insidious, silent, inevitable if left unchecked. He spoke of mercy as a poison disguised in sugar. I watched as his sermon moved the crowd. Their faces hardened, their murmurs curdled into approval. It was not heated hatred I watched there, but a clinical, institutional loathing, polished and efficient. Then they presented the allegations, each one wrapped in anodyne bureaucratic language. Failure to maintain liturgical synchrony, deviation in public devotion, undocumented thought patterns demonstrative of unorthodox reflection. The words would have been laughable in any other context, but here they were instruments, sharp and precise, each syllable a gear in the machinery of condemnation. An accuser stepped forward, someone who had once shared a ration, perhaps, or a voice in the chorus line, and spoke with thin, automatic fury about how communal prayer had been interrupted, about how discipline thinned in the presence of weakness. He did not scream. He read as if from a record. His voice was not his own. It was the voice of procedure. There was no prosecutor in the sense I had imagined, no grand figure with a fiery hat and a thunderous voice. Instead, they set before me a succession of witnesses, faces I recognized. A foreman who had nodded at my near miss in the manufactorum, a choir boy with a nervous jaw who described how I had languished on the final refrain, a neighbor who claimed I had returned late from night watch and hummed unfamiliar tunes around the sink. None of them spoke with malice. Malice was unnecessary. They spoke with the clean, dried tone of people who had learned precisely what to report and how to report it. Every statement was projected by vox across the square. Each affirmation fed into the chorus of condemnation. Their words were fed into the same machine that had fed us the hymn, and the square responded in the same way, not with thought but with a call and response of ritual outrage. Voices rose like organ pipes, penance, purge, burn. They sounded rehearsed because they were rehearsed. The crowd had been guided, the speeches prepared, the hysteria curated. I tried to speak for myself once, to say that my lapse had been a moment of fatigue, a poor breath in a life of service. The judge, tall, with a face like a slab of iron, lifted a hand. He did not scold, he merely tilted his head. In that small sentence of movement, the scaffolding of the trial became clear. It was not justice that presided, but calibration. They were weighing me not against truth, but against utility. How dangerous am I? How contagious could the idea be? How much work will it take to turn me back into a cog? I felt every gaze as an instrument of measurement. Children watched, eyes wide and memorizing. The sergeant scribbled in a ledger with a caretaker's neatness. Above us, a platform of cloaked men nodded as if to some private rhythm, and I understood they were not here for salvation. They were here to ensure survival of a system, of a creed, of a hierarchy. The human cost was a ledger line. The humiliation was orchestrated. They had benches placed so that my back was to the crowd and my face visible to the dais. Each pause I took to answer was recorded and amplified until even the silence was comment. They arranged for my family to be present, an unkindness dressed as moral instruction, so that my mother could watch and learn the lesson of obedience. She sat with her hands folded, eyes wet, mouthing prayers she could not have meant. I felt every beat of her heart like an accusation. It is strange how quickly a man's dignity is priced. The tribunal offered to me the chance to be useful. Recant, make an example, be the one who turns the knife, or refuse to turn the blade and be marked unfit. They did not use the blunt instrument of execution at first. They offered me something more subtle and more final, degradation as policy, confession as currency. The judge's voice, low, without inflection, summoned me to stand. He did not condemn in thunder. He listed options as if at a grocery counter. Penance may be reharnessing or recantation through public denouncement, or, he paused, as if choosing his words carefully, the emperor's judgment. The crowd leaned in. Even the chiming of distant machinery seemed to hush in anticipation. The phrase, emperor's judgment, held no immediate image for me, no bolt, no flame, only the slow, absolute runtime of a system that crushed those it deemed broken. He offered me a choice. Denounce another, name someone you suspect, someone whose eyes stray, someone whose voice falters, and the tribunal would record your zeal publicly. You would lead the chorus that calls for their penance. Your sentence would be mitigated. You would be transformed into a tool, a witness, a confirmer, a recruiter of obedience. Or stand silent and submit to the emperor's judgment, an abstract brutality that might mean removal, exile, or worse. The judge did not specify because specifics are unnecessary when the engine of conformity is already roaring. I thought of all the faces that had risen in the chamber. I saw the choir boy's thin jaw. I saw the foreman's neat hands. I saw my neighbor who hummed at the sink. I saw my brother, who had never once stood with me in a tribunal but who would taste the salt of suspicion if I spoke his name. The weight of that choice dropped through me like a stone into a shallow pool. The ripples spread outward in immediate, certain pattern. The crowd chanted the options into a litany. They made zeal sound like charity. They offered me the chance to be saved only by making others burn, literal or figurative. The instrumentality of it staggered me. Here was the very mechanism of state, the removal of mercy by turning it into leverage. I felt my mouth begin to form syllables. They were not mine. They were syllables shaped by fear and habit and the muscle memory of survival. I could hear the little gears inside me were, to live, name. To live, betray. To live, extend the system. To live, be part of the machinery. But there is a part of a man that remembers what cannot be confessed. Names cling to the throat. A brother's face resists being written into a charge. The judge's offer felt like an instruction in anatomy. Cut here and the machine keeps moving. Refuse and the machine removes you. The bell in the square boomed. Every head turned. The vox mast caught the hush and pushed it out in 1,000 loops. The judge's hand hovered. The moment, thin, precise, and final, stretched like iron under heat. There was no applause, no dramatic speech. Only the slow, terrible opacity of a choice that bears no moral answer, only consequences. When he spoke, his voice was small and formal. Name the one whose doubt you would correct, or stand before the emperor and be corrected. My tongue was lead. The sun baked the skin of my hands. In the crowd I glimpsed my mother, paler than the stone, mouth a thin line. Some part of me recoiled at the price of survival. Another part, terrified and fossilized, leaned toward its own preservation. I understood then the true nature of this trial. It was never about my faith. It was about binding the living to the machine by making them the machine's instruments. Confess and you remain, deny and you are erased. The judge folded his hands. The vox waited. The square watched, hungry for the syllable that would feed it. I opened my mouth. The air tasted of rust and the iron tang of inevitability, but the words stopped on the edge of my lips. The choice stood before me, a cleaver with 2 handles. And the crowd leaned forward, 1,000 throats pressing for the sound that would decide a life. They dressed the square for spectacle as if it were the most ordinary of festivals. Tarpaulins were unfurled and ropes tightened. Braziers were stoked until their tongues leapt white. Racks that had once carried tools now bore pyrowood. They had been sanded and oiled so the flames would take evenly, their grain a chosen geometry. Everything about the place had been prepared to make obliteration look like ceremony. I stood among those who had stood beside me in the hymn and felt less like a comrade than like a piece of scenery. They had given me a role and a costume, a witness, a confessor, a reformed son returned. My name still hung on the lips of the Voxmasts, thin and official as a catalog entry. They had arranged for me to be close to the plinth where those condemned would be led, close enough to see, to feel, to be reminded of the cost of the choice I had made. The condemned came forward in a procession that smelled of oil, damp cloth, and resignation. Some were led with ropes, others walked willingly, their shoulders square as if they had been taught to bear flame. I watched them pass and cataloged the variety of endings. One was young enough that his beard had not yet found full root. He kept his eyes on the sky as if searching there for an absent answer. An old man shuffled, hands gnarled like the roots of a burned tree. His mouth moved in a continuous, silent prayer. A woman, perhaps a midwife once, I thought, carried herself with a dignity that made my throat ache. The priests mounted the dais, and their sermon began not with thunder but with the measured intonation of catechism. Their words were not cries for blood, so much as instructions in the maintenance of order. They spoke in metaphors of rot and garden, of infected fruit to be removed before the whole tree sickened. They declaimed the necessity of purge, the mercy of removal, and the sanctity of fire as both instrument and purifier. The Vox amplified those phrases until they fell like rain across the crowd. I remember the way the sound reshaped the air. It came not as a single voice but as a tidal architecture, layering phrases into one another until they formed a scaffolding that supported the act. People did not react so much as synchronize. The cry of purge rose and folded back into the hymn, a dissonant chord accepted as harmony. Children clapped because they had been taught that clapping is obedience. Adults murmured assent because the habit of assent outlives the warmth of conviction. The first pyre was lit with a ritual that felt almost clinical. A priest poured promethium with the solemnity of pouring libation. There was a hiss as the liquid claimed its wood, flames licked, then roared. The air filled with a new smell, a sweet, blistering tang that ate at the edges of breath. Smoke mounted in gray columns and coiled into the sky like the smoke strokes of some giant, indifferent hand. It was beautiful in the way catastrophe is beautiful, luminous, consumptive, absolute. And yet the fire did not cleanse. That was the lesson that struck me hardest. From where I stood, I watched faces in the crowd contort as smoke flung embers into the air. They shouted, chanted, waved banners. They looked relieved, righteous, even satisfied. But the embers fell and found purchase on clothing, on hair, on exposed skin. The pyre took flesh and left ash, as promised. But it did not take the thought that had birthed the condemned. It did not take the memory, the whisper, the hesitation that had been measured and catalogued in a chamber of questions. The idea that had been the seed still moved in the mouths of those watching, a seed transposed rather than annihilated. I found that truth corrosive. If fire could not excise a doubt, what then was the point of burning? The execution hid for the moment. It smothered the visible wound with heat and light. But beneath the cinder, a blackness gathered like a wound that had been sutured badly, an infection ready to reopen. Some of the condemned screamed. Their voices were raw, animal, and the sound tore at the square like a rag through glass. Others were silent, as if silence is its own sacrament. One man, who had been our foreman and whom I had named to save myself, stood with eyes closed. When the flames enveloped him, his jaw clenched once and then relaxed as if sleep had finally arrived. The crowd stamped and cried and took from each death a parable of vigilance. They folded the scene into the doctrine and left with a safety that is always an illusion. I cannot speak for them, I can only speak for myself. Standing so near the blaze, I felt heat that went beyond the element. It was the heat of consequence, the awareness that a life had been ended at my choice, or at the choice I had made in the tribunal, pressed into me like iron. I tasted wood and hair and the metallic tang of fear on my tongue. My palms sweated beneath the habit where they rested on the rail. When the foreman's face flared, I felt something inside me calcify. There were rituals of closure, incense, prayers, a small procession of pallbearers who moved with the slow dignity of embalming. Toward the end, the priests lifted a censer and wafted smoke not to redeem but to formalize the act. They blessed the earth. They blessed the watchers. they blessed the Empire. The words flattened everything. They made atrocity feel procedural and therefore bearable. But as the heat ebbed and the embers settled into coal, what disturbed me most was not the sight of bodies turning to ash. It was the look on the faces of those who had come to see the law enforced. Some had a feverish calm, others had the pale, hollow look of those who have learned to detach. A handful, stubborn, small exceptions appeared to be thinking, not chorusing. Their brows knitted, and for a fraction of a moment I caught the expression of the man who had once asked me, in the quiet of the chapel, what if he does not hear? It was not spoken aloud then. Now in the hollow after the roar, it moved through the crowd like a ghost. There are other consequences to such ceremonies. Families of the condemned are shown exactly where the state holds its mercy, and how thin that mercy can be. A mother's wail will be processed into a footnote, emotional disturbance handled. A sibling's grief becomes a lesson in obedience for others. The spectacle hardens a community by offering an enemy to fear and a demonstration of power to witness. It binds them together in the simplest way, a shared horror that everyone agrees to perform. Even as the last embers cooled, I could see, in quick, nervous exchanges, how the doctrine of purification had found new lines of work. Men looked from neighbor to neighbor, weighing, measuring, confirming. Hands reached for legislates, fingers made marks. The machinery of suspicion recommenced, now armed with examples and efficiency. The pyre had been an advert, and its lesson was being applied with the same careful cruelty as any engineered process. I wanted to believe that once the fires ended, so would the fear. But fear is not a commodity you can spend in one purchase. It yields patterns, expectations, trained reflexes. Those who had observed the spectacle would return to their shifts and their homes with a new fluency in noticing the wrong breath, the slight falter at the idol's name, the way a man holds his spoon on the left instead of the right. The state had taught them attention. It had taught them to be instruments of maintenance. And yet, a smaller, more dangerous thing occurred as the torches were lowered and the priest's song dwindled. A hush passed over a part of the crowd. It was not the silent approval they had rehearsed. It was a whisper, thin as the first smoke from a cooling ember, and I heard it as surely as I heard the bell. What if he does not hear? The words were the same ones that had first unstitched the hem of my faith. They flowed from a throat in the middle distance, a voice bunched low against the chest, as if the speaker feared having his doubt taken by the air. The cadence was not a shout of rebellion, but the tremulous question of someone who, having watched a man burn and not seen his doubt vanish, is finally brave enough to wonder aloud. The sound passed through the square like a current. Heads turned not with the mechanical obedience I had grown used to, but with an actual, fragile attention. For a blink, the crowd was not a chorus but a collection of individuals, each facing a private, dangerous possibility. A priest's hand flashed, a reminder of duty. A guard's throat tightened. The person who had whispered shrank into the crowd. No one, yet, laid hands on him. But the thought had been seeded, a small, slow thing that would take root in ash-laden soil. I felt the iron in my chest twist. That utterance, the same vulnerable question I had once felt as a seed, now traveled beyond me. It was neither absolution nor accusation. It was proof that the ember of doubt does not end with fire. It migrates, quiet as smoke, into the heart of another. The pyre's light had shown a truth I could not deny. Eradication of bodies does not extinguish the mind that harbors a question. If anything, it throws the question like a splinter into the audience's hand. They must either learn to hold it or learn to flay themselves to rid it. I left the square with my palms smelling of smoke and my throat lined with ash. The sound of the whisper clung to me, tiny, unwilling to go. In the weeks that followed, I watched the city change in nearly imperceptible ways. An extra ledger entry here, an abrupt reassignment there, a child taught to stare longer at the shrine. The machinery turned. The memory of the pyre was folded into policy, but the whisper remained. And somewhere in a corridor or a chapel or the quiet of a mattress on a bunk beneath the hab block, someone would think it and perhaps one day say it aloud again. What if he does not hear? They taught us to sanctify repetition until ritual swallowed question. They did not teach that a single doubt, once spoken or recorded, would not die with the speaker but lodge in paper and ledger and the soft memory of neighbors. It travels when a clerk ticks a box and when a foreman coughs at the wrong time in the line. In a place governed by systems, a thought can be translated into action by the mere act of being noticed. I count the cost in simple measures: names filed, ration tokens clipped, apprenticeships canceled. Those are the mundane ledgers of punishment. The brutal things are quieter: the glance that becomes avoidance, the favor withheld and never returned, the child reassigned for the safety of the guild. Small administrative acts accumulate into a slow extinction that is accredited by signature and stamp. When my name appeared in the file, other names followed as if gravity pulled them into the same orbit. A single whisper became columns of ink, then directives, then reassignments. A foreman who once shared salt and bread watched his boy shifted to the lower pits. A sister lost her station after an examiner noted associations. Families break under the etiquette of procedure. Grief is made bureaucratic, folded into forms and sealed with wax. Suspicion becomes a craft. People learn to read the precise silence between hymns, to time a bow, to watch the angle of a head. It is mundane, teachable, efficient. The state taught the lesson with forms and protocols. There is elegance in that cruelty. The engine needs no spectacle because it is thorough, and thoroughness is its mercy and its weapon. Neighbors become calculators. Their kindness is repurposed into caution. The man who lent me tools checks a list before offering help now. He recites the phrase "procedures changed" as if reading scripture. Habit hardens into law. The community becomes, in equal parts, warder and warded, referee and prisoner. Public executions made for a lesson, private measures made it stick. After the pyres, new directives reached every workline: associational monitoring, routine reassessment. The vocabulary changed, and so did the lives it named. Where once a hand was extended in trust, now a ledger entry verified the exchange so that generosity itself could be audited and curtailed. One woman I knew folded her grief into ration tokens. Her husband had been reassigned to another station after a form listed him under review. She lined up at dawn and took the portion allotted and counted it as though that arithmetic could replace a life. Her silence was not acceptance but a strategy. Screams invited attention, and attention would yield consequences for those still present. Grief, therefore, became private, a resource to be hoarded or hidden. The sounds of this economy are small and particular. There is the soft clack of a stamp on wax, the whisper of a seal broken, the quiet whir of the records room fans as a new file spins into operation. There is the rustle of parchment as names are read, the cough of a clerk who has seen too many hours. These are not dramatic noises. They are the daily metronome of erasure. The system is adaptive. Each incident of mercy or hesitation produces an adjustment. New boxes to tick, new phrases to recite, an extra clerical check added to the watch protocol. It learns by punishment and trains through fear. The machinery of governance eats the exception and reconfigures, producing new procedures to catch the next falter. I learned to live a life of small arithmetic, maintain visible hands, answer in the right cadence, keep thy gaze measured, never let personal warmth be unrecorded. These practices are not spiritual, they are survival strategies. They cost a slow erosion of self. Laughter thins into an echo. Memory becomes contraband. Tenderness is folded into pieces of cloth and hidden until the hour feels safe. Bureaucracy produces a particular intimacy with betrayal. A friend may hand you a cup, and with one polite question gather data you never thought to guard. "Did you attend the vigil?" is phrased like concern but functions as an audit. The politeness matters. Cruelty dressed in procedure is harder to resist because it leaves no villain to strike. It leaves nothing but the inexorable ink of record keeping. Children learn early. I saw a boy in a habline taught to count the syllables of a hymn by his tutor as if timing the chant were arithmetic practice. His hands moved with the litany, and when he turned to me there was a complexity in his small expression. Curiosity boxed and then sealed. That the system trains the young makes the future efficient in adherence and all the more fearful. At times I thought of small resistances. A whispered counterprayer, a line of illegal verse smeared into a scene, the furtive handing of bread. Each is tiny and bright and dangerous. The lattice absorbs them and then reroutes the danger into the same channels that prevent their spread. For every gesture of humanity, you may carve a route that the system plugs with new reporting lines. Memory is persistent. I hide memories beneath cloth and between timber joints. I burn what cannot be kept. Memory can serve as both solace and evidence. Remembering a forgotten laugh is dangerous because it proves one once knew something other than duty. It becomes a liability to recall warmth. I have been both instrument and victim. I named names when asked. I kept my silence when it served my survival. Each concession bought me a day. Each day bought me the capacity to keep breathing. But survival is not victory. It is a ledger of small trades. I traded other people's certainties for my continued presence. The calculus haunts me like an unquiet ledger, its columns filled with small thefts I perform to remain intact. There is a soundscape that will not leave me. Bells clanging for road observance, furnaces sighing, the quiet hiss of paper being fed into a cogitator. Under these institutional noises is another sound, the hollow echo of absence. It is the silence of unburied things, a note missing from the hymn. It is an empty chair at a table where someone once laughed. That silence is not peace. It is a weight you carry at the base of your throat. I remember a child once asking aloud at the end of a sermon why we burn those they call traitors if the thought remains. The question was not rhetorical. It cut through the choreography. Parents hushed him and the priest smiled as if the child had learned a new litany, but for a beat the congregation paused. The hiccup of attention was a dangerous thing. Someone recorded it, and later that child's name was noted as in need of instruction. A question so simple became a line on a file. I write these words in secret, by scraping light and hidden ink, because memory refuses to be entirely filed away. I fold pages into the hems of my robe and burn them when the hour seems safe. I do this not because I believe my words will change policy, but because naming what was taken is a way of owning the ledger that others have tried to keep closed. This is not a manifesto. It is an inventory and an apology and a witness. I have lived amid the records and I have helped make them. I own that complicity. I do not beg for absolution. There is none to be had. I offer instead accounting. Who lost what forms were opened, which hearths went quiet, which children were moved because a name touched mine. The lamp gutters. The warders make their rounds. The records room hums. Someone somewhere will add a line to a file and the mechanism will click forward. The people who survive are left with choices that are not noble, to become instruments of enforcement or to be dissolved by it. I chose survival and thereby assisted the architecture. And so I stop, not because I have found an answer, but because silence is required now. The lamp is out. The paper curls in the dark. The smallest sound might map back to me. I fold this page into my sleeve and press it to my skin a final time. Silence.